Thanks very much for coming and for allowing me to come and talk to you today about some of the research we're doing. I'm part of a 3-year project at the University of Glasgow funded by the John Templeton Foundation, and we're interested in the nature of suffering and the value of suffering. And one of the things we wanted to do as part of the project is talk to people outside of academia. Philosophers and academics typically aren't very good at that. So one of the things we wanted to do is have a series of public talks, write a series of articles for the general press, and we have a website which is interactive where we hope people will share their stories of suffering, where there are links to articles about suffering in the newspapers and in other media. And so we want this to be genuinely interactive. And so one of the things I'm doing, this is the first talk of 3, and I want to tell you a little bit about the kinds of things we're looking at on the project. So that's the title. A little bit about what philosophy is to begin, just very, very basically, some basic information about that, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about the kinds of questions we're interested in and the kind of research that I'm doing. So, what is philosophy? I hate that question because it's a really, really difficult question. Here's very, very basically what it is. I mean, it's from the Greek roots, philo meaning love, and sophos meaning wisdom. So philosophy is love of wisdom, and what philosophers try and do is to understand important things about ourselves and about the world. That's the general topic. So here are some philosophical questions, and hopefully I'll try and convince people that it's not an arcane, weird subject. Philosophy deals with parts of our own experiences in the world that we're all familiar with, and it asks important questions about these. So here's one important question that philosophers ask in political philosophy. What's the ground of our political obligation? That's the question in political philosophy. Why ought we to do what the state tells us to do? And you start to think about that for a few minutes and you see it's kind of a puzzling question. I mean, if a stranger comes up to you on the street and tells you to do something, then I take it your polite response is, no, why should I? The mere fact that a stranger's told you to do something doesn't give you any reason to obey. So why should the fact that the state tells you to do something, why should that give you good reason to obey? And you might say, well, if I don't, I'll go to prison. And that's a reason, but it's a threat. And people think the reason you ought to obey what the state says ought not to be that kind of reason. So maybe we say, okay, well, we've entered into a contract with the state by voting. That's part of a contract. So I ought to obey what the government says because they're voting. Well, maybe you didn't vote for the current party. Maybe you didn't vote at all. Maybe the people who you vote for never get represented. So why should you do what the people in power say? Maybe you benefited, you could say. That's why you ought to obey, because you benefited. And therefore you owe obligation. But the mere fact that you benefit doesn't mean you have an obligation to obey what people want you to do. And suppose I'm attracted to someone and buy them a gift, a very lavish, expensive gift. And then I say to the person, okay, you're under an obligation to go on a date with me. That's the wrong kind of reason. I imagine the person will say no. I'm under no obligation whatsoever. The mere fact you give me a gift doesn't mean I have an obligation. You start asking questions like that, and soon you hit upon a puzzle. Why should we do what the state says? What's the reason? Some people think there's no reason, and those people are anarchists. There's no legitimate reason to do what the government tells you to do. Other people think there are legitimate reasons, and they try and tell you what they are. That's what political philosophy does. It's not an arcane subject. It goes to the heart of really important things. Philosophy of art. What's beauty? Is beauty objective? Is it subjective? These are the kinds of questions that aestheticians or people interested in philosophy of art ask. Philosophy of mind. Is the mind purely material? Can computers think? Are they conscious? Ethics. What makes things right or wrong? So these are all kind of philosophical questions, deep philosophical questions about central parts of our life. And that's why we're interested in suffering, because as the song said, everyone hurts, everyone suffers. It's a common fact of human life and an unfortunate fact that we all suffer. So that's one reason to ask philosophical questions about suffering. We all suffer. And most people have a kind of idea, a good idea about what pain and suffering are. We've all experienced them. So that's reason to ask questions about them. But Plato says you need more than mere experiences or kinds of examples of things in order to have true understanding. You have to look at the thing itself deeply and try and figure out what it is and what it does. So that's what philosophers do, what we're trying to do with the project. Look at kinds of suffering and see what suffering is, what it does, and what potential value it has, in a way that I'll explain shortly. Another reason to look at this is, look, if we understand what suffering is, we might be in a better position to treat it. We have to know what we're treating. So studies that look at the nature of suffering and its value might put clinicians in a better position to treat this phenomenon. Okay, so that's why we're kind of interested in these things. It's a central fact of human existence, and very few philosophers have really thought about it that much. We want to think a little bit more. Okay. Different types of suffering. So that's what we'll start off with. There's lots of different types of suffering. Again, this is old news. So physical pain is a kind of suffering, and lots of different kinds of pain. There's acute pain, which is short-term, and there's chronic pain, which is long-term. Pains in different parts of your body. Pains have different causes. Pains have different qualities. You can have sharp pain, dull pain, there's a dull ache, stinging pain, burning, all different kinds of qualities of pain. So one of the most obvious cases of suffering is physical pain. But there's also emotional suffering. Grief, disappointment, guilt, shame. So it's a bit depressing. All of these things are negative emotional experiences, and they're kinds of suffering. People grieve, and that's a paradigm example where people are terribly disappointed. Physical suffering that might not be identical with pain. Extreme tiredness is a kind of physical suffering. Coldness, hunger, nausea, extreme irritation, these are all physical kinds of suffering. And there's mental suffering which might not be equivalent to emotional suffering. Suffering of anxiety, for instance. Loneliness. When you're heartbroken, that's a obvious form of mental suffering. Frustration, picture me being lonely in the Highlands. But these are clearly types of suffering, and important types of suffering, and that's one of the ways in which our lives go badly, if we suffer from mental suffering. So here's a philosophical question. What do these have in common? Why are these all kinds of suffering? One answer is they all feel bad. It's not the answer of a genius. You've not suddenly leapt up in the air saying, oh God, that's fantastic, we found something out. But one of the things that these things have in common is they all feel bad. They all feel terrible. Here's a more philosophical question. What is it for something to feel bad or feel terrible? So all of these things feel bad, but then we might ask the philosophical question, what is it for them to feel bad or feel terrible? Well, here's one suggestion that some philosophers have proposed. All of these different kinds of things have a particular feeling in common. All red things have a particular kind of visual quality in common. Redness. That's why all red things have that in common. Similarly, you might think certain foodstuffs or drinks have a particular taste in common. All versions of IPA beer, all versions of IPA beer have a particular taste sensation in common. They're all kind of hoppy, fruity. So that's what IPA beers have in common. What the forms of suffering have in common? Well, some people think there's a particular quality, particular feeling. The problem with that line is it's really difficult when we introspect to try to identify what that feeling is. So consider the following types of suffering. One is when you stub your toe. Then compare that with the disappointment of not getting the job. Compare that with being freezing cold on a winter's morn. Compare that with nausea. Compare that with anxiety. Compare that with loneliness. Do all of these forms of suffering have any particular feeling in common? It's difficult to see that they do. It's difficult to try and figure out. Introspect, try and think about your experience of these. Is there any one feeling that they have in common that's equivalent to the hoppy taste of IPA beer, for instance? Difficult to see what this would be. Even in the class of pains, pains are so disparate, so varied, it doesn't look as if they have one particular quality. Stubbing your toe, a headache, a stomach cramp, an aching knee, these are all kinds of physical pain, but they don't have any particular feeling in common. So lots of people think that's a bad answer. So what makes all these kinds of things suffering? Well, a better answer, lots of people think, is they're simply states of the body, sensations that we dislike, that we desire that they stop. That's true of headaches, it's true of extreme hunger, tiredness, anxiety, loneliness, broken bones, etc. They're all sensations that we dislike or desire to stop. And that's what they have in common. That's why this wide variety of experiences are all kinds of suffering, because they're simply things that we dislike or want to stop. That's a philosophical question, and there's lots of debate between various people, including people on our team, as to which answer's the best one. But I'm inclined to that one. I think that's a better answer than that one. So that's a very, very rough view of what suffering is. Suffering is a sensation, bodily sensation, and there's a wide variety of different kinds of sensations that we dislike, we desire that they stop. That's a very brief account. More importantly for this talk, let's think about the value or disvalue of suffering. Here's something that is pretty obvious again. Pain and suffering are bad. And they're intrinsically bad, to use a philosophical term of art. They're bad in themselves. It's bad in itself to experience something that you dislike. There's something in the very nature of pain and suffering that make them bad, make them things that we have reason to avoid. Pretty much everyone's going to agree with that, I think. But they're also instrumentally bad. They're bad because of the bad effects that they have. Think about how pain and suffering can affect your life so that you can't do other things. It can affect your daily life. Even very, very basic things are affected negatively if you're in pain, if you're suffering. But it can affect your jobs, it can affect your relationship, your work, your hobbies. So pain and suffering are bad in themselves, but they're also bad because they have bad effects on the rest of your life, on other aspects of your life. And as the picture shows, they have terrible effects on the lives of others. If a family member or a loved one is suffering, then you suffer. This has a negative effect on your life as well. So one of the bad things about pain and suffering is bad for the individual who suffers, but it's also bad for other people. People in their community, people in their family. Everyone pretty much agrees with that, and nothing in our project is trying to undermine that. So pain and suffering are bad, and we should, when we can, seek to alleviate as much pain and suffering as we can as well. So when we talk about the value of suffering, I don't want to say, yay, suffering, we should do what we can to bring about more. That's clearly true. They're bad things, and we should alleviate them because they're one of the main things that make human life go badly. But because people have pretty much accepted that, then very few people have really thought, well, are there any ways in which pain and suffering are good? And it's such a central feature of our lives, you might think that we suffer for a reason. There's a reason that we creatures are like this. We're creatures that feel pain, we're creatures that suffer. So what might that reason be? What roles and values might they have in our life? And what I want to talk about for the rest of the talk are 3 ways in which pain and suffering can be good. And we're better off if we have, because we have. We're better off because we suffer. Now, it might be the case that these good things don't outweigh the bad, but sometimes they might. Sometimes the good things that you get from pain and suffering might very well outweigh the intrinsic badness. And that's something that we want to think about. What are the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons of pain and suffering? So here's one way in which pain and suffering are good. How can suffering be good? Number 1. An obvious way is it protects us from damage. Paul Brand, we'll look at Paul Brand in a minute, but Paul Brand has a book called Pain, the Gift That No One Wants. But I don't think that's quite right, because when we're not in pain, we're really glad that we have pain systems. We're really glad when we're not suffering pain, not in the moment, but when we're no longer in pain, we're really glad that we're the kind of creatures that suffer. Why? It's really important for us as human beings and other animals that we suffer pain, physical pain. Because people who don't survive very long. It's an important survival mechanism. So it's that case of Miss C. Miss C was a Canadian woman, and young Canadian woman, and perfectly normal in every way, except that she didn't feel pain. She was a pain insensitive. It's a sad, tragic case because she suffered all kinds of injuries because she couldn't feel pain. So when she was young, she bit the tip of her tongue off when she was eating. She got third-degree burns on her knees because she was leaning against the radiator and didn't realise the damage that was being caused. She suffered something called Charcot joint, which is a condition that affects your joints and ligaments. Basically, it means that the joints and ligaments just deteriorate so much that they can't operate anymore. And it happens when the ligaments in your joints get stretched and damaged slightly. Now, this happens to all of us all of the time. That's why people limp. You know what it's like. You pull a muscle, you get a joint damage, and you limp. She didn't do that because she didn't get a signal from the joint saying that something's wrong. So when all the time I'm doing it now, I shift position. And you all shift position when you're sitting and when you're in bed at night and when you're working at the desk. You constantly shift position when the position you're in is proving bad and it starts to hurt you. So you shift to protect your body. She couldn't do that because she didn't get the signals. So what happened to her joints is over the years they just got severely damaged because she was constantly using muscles and joints that were damaged and she didn't know about it. They got so bad they massively infected, and at the age of 29 she died. But she lasted quite long for a pain insensitive. If we didn't have pain systems, we'd be like Miss C. So one of the ways in which suffering and pain can be valuable is it prevents that. So in more detail, you might think the pain system has two functions. One, it alerts us to the presence of what we can call noxious stimuli and motivates avoidance. Again, this is something that we all know. You put your hand on a hot plate, painful, you move it very quickly, so that you don't get damaged. Or the threat of pain, you move your hand and body away. So one of the ways in which pain has value is it alerts us to the presence of noxious stimuli and motivates avoidance. But it also protects and repairs and restores parts of our bodies that have already been damaged. It restricts movements. That's why when you damage a ligament, when you damage a joint, it becomes tender. So you don't put more pressure on it. And therefore, you allow your body to repair. It's an important part of our protective restoration system. Pain allows us to do that. Without these systems, we'd be like Miss C. We wouldn't have any information about our bodies being damaged. Okay. Now, at this point, you might think, okay, well, in that case, why didn't we evolve, or why didn't God create us to be such that when we do things that damage our body, we just get a message in our brains that says, stop doing that. Just like a sign. You're kneeling on something hot, stop it. You've hurt your knee, don't play football anymore. Something like that. Why don't we just get a message in our brain? And that would have solved the problem, wouldn't it, for Miss C? Why does it have to hurt, in other words? Why couldn't we have systems whereby we protect ourselves and our body without the horrible painfulness of pain? Well, here's why. Here's one example from Paul Brand, who I mentioned earlier. So Paul Brand was an orthopedic surgeon, saintly man. And he wanted to develop a pain system for people who no longer felt pain. For people with defective pain perception. For instance, people who suffered from leprosy. And Brand and his fellow surgeons and researchers wanted ways in which leprosy sufferers could be given information about times when they're damaging their body, but in a way that didn't hurt. So he wanted to create a pain system, a substitute pain system, which would give us the good bits of pain, namely the information that we're doing things that are damaging our body, without the bad. It wouldn't be painful. Wouldn't that be really great if we could do that? So Brand and his fellow researchers made gloves and clothing with lots of sensors on them. And they hooked this up, first of all, they hooked it up to something like a hearing aid, so that with normal pressure, you would hear a buzz. The leprosy patients would. With more pressure, it would be a louder noise, and when they were manipulating things sufficiently to damage their body, there would be a really loud noise. And this would tell them to stop doing that. So that was the system. So it wouldn't be pain, but it would be ways in which noise can tell you that you're damaging your body, give you that information. What happened? They ignored it. Leprosy patients who were, for instance, manipulating a screwdriver in such a way that they were causing themselves further damage. Loud noise went off, they just overrode the noise, they just didn't pay attention to it. They just carried on doing what they were doing. And so they tried flashing lights. That didn't work either. They tried everything. And the depressing conclusion was, unless you make it painful, people are just going to carry on doing it. Now, at that point, you might think, well, I wouldn't. If I got information that I was damaging my body, if I got a message in my brain saying you're damaging your body, stop doing it, I'd stop, wouldn't I? Wouldn't we all do that? Well, I'm not sure. As someone who smoked for 20 years, I knew full well what I was doing to my body when I was smoking. I had knowledge that this is a way in which I'm damaging my body. Did it stop? No. Maybe it gave me a bit of an impulse to stop, but not much, because I kept on smoking for 20 years. So mere information that you're doing things that are bad for your body typically doesn't motivate you, as smokers know. That's why if you want to make people stop smoking, make them nauseous. That's much more effective than giving them the information. So the point about the brand system is you can't get the good bits, the motivation, without the bad. It has to hurt, because hurt prioritises what's happening. Information about what I was doing to my body didn't prioritise stopping smoking. I had a PhD to write, I had fun to have. You know, these motives completely defeated the motive that the knowledge gave me. If it was painful or it was nauseous, that would be much more effective. That's why pains hurt. It's good for you that they hurt, because you'll be motivated because they do. This is true not just of pain, but other forms of suffering. Fear and disgust, these move us very quickly. Move us away from things that are potentially dangerous or contaminated. And also, interestingly, guilt and shame can repair and restore. So just as pain has a restoration system, so can negative emotion like guilt and shame. Guilt's a really good one. Guilt's a really nice example. What happens when I do something morally wrong? Well, if people find out, my social standing is lowered. And that can have negative effects. People don't deal with me anymore if I'm a trader. If I'm caught lying and cheating, then no one's going to engage in contracts with me. My friends might not be friends anymore. So what you do when you do something morally wrong, your social standing is lowered. How do you repair your social standing when you've done something wrong? Well, you apologise. You make reparations. That makes the other person feel better if you apologise to them. But also, if you apologise and people accept the apology, then suddenly your social standing is restored. Or at least it's better than it would be if you didn't apologise. Okay. But as we all know, apologies are really difficult to make. It's not nice to apologise. It's really difficult to make. And without a good motive to apologise, we tend to backslide. We tend not to apologise. We just try and forget about it. Guilt gives you a really good motive. Why? Because it's miserable to feel guilty. And as we all know, saying sorry makes you feel better. So one of the things that the negative emotion of guilt does is make you do things you've got good reason to do, namely apologise, because it makes you feel better. Guilt, interestingly, makes you able to endure more pain. Brock Bastian, who's one of our colleagues, well, he's working at University of Sydney, he's done really interesting experiments with something called a cold pressor. And he's shown that if you feel guilty, you can withstand more pain. So you put the point of the cold pressor is you put your hand in cold water and see how long you can keep it. It's really, really cold. People can endure more pain. He got his subjects, some of them at least, to think about something they'd done which was immoral for 10 minutes before they put their hand in. They could endure much more pain than people who weren't feeling guilty. So one of the things that guilt can do is make you endure more pain. I was thinking about this earlier. I'm going to try this when I go to the dentist next time. And I might be able to endure more pain. The dental trip might be more pleasurable if I think about something I've done wrong beforehand, because then it won't feel as bad. So that's one of the things that guilt can do. Lots of interesting experiments that Bastian's done on this one. That's one way in which suffering can have value. It motivates, and it protects, and it restores. Here's another way. It has communicative value. And it has value for the sufferer if, because you're suffering, this is communicated to others. One of the things that this might enable others to do is to help you when you need help. So Neanderthal skeletons from 200,000 years ago show evidence of healed major bone fractures, which indicates that they received significant amounts of help while the bone healed. And you might think they could ensure that help by communicating their suffering and their pain to others. So it doesn't just motivate you, it motivates others to help you if you communicate. Now you could tell people you're in pain. We could try that these days, but it's much less reliable. If I go to a doctor and with a straight face say, "Doctor, I'm in agony," the doctor might not believe me. So the communicative value of suffering is it gets people to believe you. If you're suffering, it shows on your face. So it's valuable for the sufferer, people help you. It's valuable for the group. It's important for our group as a whole to detect when other members in the group are suffering. Why? Because the survival of the group might depend upon everyone being operating in the best fashion. So again, it has group value because it tells others what you're like, the state that you're in. Less positively, it gives antagonists a chance to exploit you. So I mean, it has value for the antagonist. If I know that you're suffering, I'm in a position to exploit you. So in a way, there's a kind of balancing act here. Expression of suffering is really good because it helps people help you. It enables people to help you, but it might put you at a disadvantage. Unfortunately, we can't control that much our facial expression of suffering. We can to an extent. Boxers are quite good at it. You don't want to show suffering if someone's punching you about the head. You don't want to give them the impression that they're getting the advantage. But typically we're not. So it's a difficult act to balance between expressing and not expressing suffering. But that's another way in which suffering can be valuable. A third way, picture of Friedrich Nietzsche. Great picture. Nietzsche thought it can promote health and strength. That sounds paradoxical, because you might think suffering precisely indicates when you've been damaged, when you're ill. But Nietzsche thought that it can promote health and strength in an interesting way. Famously, he wrote, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." And you hear this a lot. Ed Miliband said it, didn't they? About his current trials and tribulations. But lots of people think it. Lots of people think, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." He thought suffering is essential for health and strength. And in a way, a kind of interesting way that we can talk about, we'll see in a little bit. Now, lots of people think that quote's clearly false. Because, you know, there could be lots of things that don't kill you but weaken you. So isn't Nietzsche just mistaken? Well, Nietzsche didn't think it was for everyone either. Nietzsche didn't think that's true of everyone. He thought it was only true of a very restricted number of people. The great and the noble. Because he thought only the great and the noble were strong enough to withstand the benefit from suffering. Who are the great and noble? When sometimes he writes that there's only 3 people. Beethoven, Goethe and himself. So yeah, he had a very narrow class. I mean, in his defence, Nietzsche suffered terribly. He was extremely sick and ill man for large parts of his life, and yet produced works of genius. So, you know, he certainly was someone who suffered terribly, and at the same time, during this, produced great works. And he thought that he produced great works because of his illness. So suffering has another positive value, the value of creativity. But why think that? Why think that that's a way in which suffering can have value? It's essential for health and strength, as Nietzsche thought. Certainly it was true of some people. Well, here's one way in which it might be true. At the level of the species. Adversity is good at the species level. Why? Well, it gets rid of the weaker members of the species. So that's the principle behind survival of the fittest. So you might think one way in which adversity, pain, suffering can have value is at the level of a species. It's a similar principle behind, biological principle behind vaccination. You make yourself a little bit weaker so your body can overcome and therefore become stronger. So that's one very, very broad level. Another level is a physical level. If it's not hurting, it's not working. No pain, no gain. In order to build muscle mass, you have to damage muscle tissue. So when you work out, there are microscopic tears in the muscle tissue. When they repair themselves, you build muscle. That's the principle behind weightlifting. So you might think that you get physical benefits from pain and suffering. But Nietzsche was much more concerned with the psychological level. And here's why he thought, even in the midst of terrible suffering and terrible illness, here's why Nietzsche thought he was healthy. Because he thought health and strength are matters of positive attitude. That's what they were then. So he thought the problem of suffering wasn't so much that people suffered, he thought the problem was it led to despair. And that, he thought, was weak and ill. So he thought that really the problem of suffering is that people don't have the right kind of attitude towards it. But in the midst of his suffering, he thought it was a revelation, Nietzsche, when he was ill for months and years. He got a revelation that I'm going to take a positive, optimistic attitude towards it. And that's what strength was for him. Being optimistic in the face of terrible suffering. And he thought, actually, the stronger you are, the more noble you are, the more suffering you take on, so you can remain positive. That's why he thought it was essential for health and suffering. The real problem of suffering is despair in the face of it. It's a pessimistic attitude. We all want to say that's what Nietzsche thought. You might think that's pushing things way too far, but there's something plausible about Nietzsche's idea. At the psychological level, there's something plausible about the idea that psychological health and strength involve, in a way, this kind of positive attitude, or at least not a negative, despairing attitude. Why? Well, suffering can allow us to express strength of character. That's one way in which suffering makes you stronger, because it enables you to express these things which can be regarded as virtues of character. Fortitude, resilience, patience, and courage. You have to suffer in order to display these virtues, in order to develop them, and in order to display them. You can't be really courageous unless you face danger. You can't be resilient or patient unless you're suffering, facing adversity in some way. So you might think one way in which suffering promotes strength is it allows you to be strong in these ways. And at a much more general level, the British Psychological Society regards resilience in the face of adversity, the kind of attitude that Nietzsche thought you should have. Because this is really important for psychological health. This is one of the marks of the psychologically healthy person. Resilience in the face of adversity. Unlike Nietzsche, they say this is ordinary. This is something that is just standard equipment for human beings. So it's not just for the great and noble. Being resilient in the face of adversity is what human beings typically are like. So it's not extraordinary, it's an ordinary facet of our lives. So a third way in which pain and suffering might be valuable is they promote health and strength, not in the kind of Nietzschean way, not as extreme as that, but because they allow you to be virtuous in these ways, to be resilient, to show fortitude, and to show courage. Okay, and they're important. So, quote, life's not about how fast you run or how high you climb, but how well you bounce. It's being resilient in the face of adversity that's really important for psychological health and strength. 3 ways in which suffering can have value. There's lots and lots of other ways. That's what seems really good about philosophy. Once you start thinking about these questions, then more and more questions occur. So some people think suffering is necessary for pleasure. Masochists think that, but you don't have to be masochistic to think there's something true about that idea. You know, going into a warm room after you've been waiting at the bus stop for 45 minutes in the freezing cold, that's really nice. It's only because you're really cold and then you get the warmth of the room or the warmth of a bath. Or if you're very, very thirsty and you have an ice cold drink. So what's the film Ice Cold in Alex? The 50s film, and they're you know, in the desert, and finally they get to the pub and they have an ice cold bed. It's just so pleasurable because they've been in the desert for weeks. So you might think suffering is necessary. Well, it's good for lots of different kinds of pleasure. Some people think it's necessary for creativity. Some people think that a lot of religious traditions are grounded in suffering. Some people think it has symbolic value. Some people think it has, well, value as an initiation. You join the club if you suffer. That's what initiation rites are for. That's what hazing rituals are for. That's what all kinds of rituals make people suffer, so if you endure that, then you're a member of the club. I was once flying to Los Angeles, and it was a terrible flight. And I tried to land twice, it was 747, tried to land twice, and couldn't, and it was really, really bumpy. And eventually we went off and landed at another airport. And the people who got off then formed pretty quickly 2 groups. The ones, people like me, who were almost crying in terror and fear, and the people who said, that was nothing. You should have been on the plane when. And suddenly it was a badge of honour for them that they suffered in that way. And they were part of that club who, you know, suffered terribly. So you might think suffering is part of the price you pay for admittance to a club. All kinds of ways in which suffering can have value in addition to these three ways. So we're going to investigate more of these. So how can suffering be good? 4, 5 and 6. Well, watch this space. That's our website. And part of the things we'll be doing over the next couple of years is advertise more talks and workshops and conferences and investigate the ways in which suffering can have value along these further dimensions. Now, none of that's to say, as I mentioned earlier, none of it is to say that all things considered suffering is a good thing, or that we ought not to be in the business of alleviating suffering. Clearly we ought to be, because a lot of suffering, maybe the vast majority of instances of suffering, all things considered bad and things we ought to get rid of. But it's interesting philosophically and just in general to think about the ways in which these things might be of value in our lives. Okay, so finally, just before 10 minutes for questions, thanks to my colleagues Dr. David Bain, Jennifer Corns, Abraham Cordoba, John Templeton Foundation, who fund us, the Centre at the University of Glasgow, and everyone here for allowing me to speak, and everyone here for turning up. Thank you very much. Everybody hurts sometimes.